Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive.
It's good to be back.
Today we're going to be diving into one of the most consequential amendments to the Constitution.
Absolutely.
14th Amendment.
Yeah.
It's a long one.
It is a long one, and it's complicated.
It is complicated, and there's a lot to unpack.
Right.
So to get us started, can you give us just a little bit of a high-level overview of what the 14th Amendment is?
Sure. So the 14th Amendment, it was passed shortly after the Civil War.
Okay.
And it was really intended to address a lot of the issues that were left over in the aftermath of the Civil War. And one of its main goals was to ensure the equal protection of the laws for all citizens.
Okay, so it's all about equality.
Right.
Seems pretty simple in theory.
In theory, yeah, the wording might seem simple, but the application has been anything but.
So what kind of issues did it address specifically? I mean, you said it was trying to kind of clean up the aftermath of the Civil War.
Right. So one of the biggest issues was the status of formerly enslaved people. You know, they had been freed, but were they truly citizens? Did they have the same rights and protections as white citizens?
So the 14th Amendment was trying to answer that question.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it did so in several ways. The first and most important, I think, was that it granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States.
So finally saying definitively that black people are citizens.
Yes, that's right. This overturns the Dred Scott decision.
Oh, wow.
Which had said that black people could not be citizens.
Huge.
Yeah, it was huge.
Okay, so citizenship, that's a big one. What else?
Well, it also includes these clauses about privileges or immunities, due process of law, and equal protection of the laws.
Those sound kind of familiar.
Well, yeah, you hear those phrases a lot today, and that's because they're still very relevant.
So these were the parts that really got into the nitty-gritty of equality.
Right. They were designed to make sure that all citizens had the same basic rights and protections, regardless of their race.
Okay, so it sounds like the 14th Amendment was really trying to fundamentally change the relationship between the federal government and the states, especially when it comes to protecting individual rights.
Absolutely. Before the 14th Amendment, states had a lot of power to decide who was a citizen and what rights they had. But the 14th Amendment said no. The federal government is going to step in and make sure everyone is treated equally.
It was a huge shift in power.
It was, and it didn't go over well with everyone, especially in the South.
Yeah, I can imagine there was a lot of pushback.
There was a lot of pushback. We'll get into that later. But for now, it's important to understand that the 14th Amendment was a radical idea.
A radical idea for a nation still healing from a brutal war.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the context of its creation is so crucial to understanding its impact.
Okay, so let's talk about that context. I mean, we've already alluded to the fact that the country was in a very fragile state after the Civil War.
Yeah, the South was devastated physically and economically.
And politically, too, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And there was a lot of resentment and anger towards the North and towards the newly freed black population.
Which unfortunately led to a lot of violence.
Sadly, yes. There were numerous incidents of racial violence during this period. The Memphis and New Orleans riots of 1866 are just two examples.
I read about those. They were horrific.
They were mobs of white people attacking black communities, burning homes, businesses, churches.
Dozens were killed.
Yeah, dozens were killed and many more were injured.
And this wasn't just random violence, right? It was organized and in some cases even sanctioned by local authorities.
That's right. These riots were a clear indication that even though slavery had been abolished, racial prejudice and hatred were still very much alive.
And it wasn't just mob violence, right?
Yeah.
There were also laws being passed specifically targeting black people.
You're talking about the Black Codes?
Yeah, these laws were basically trying to recreate the conditions of slavery through legal means.
Exactly. They were designed to restrict the freedoms of black people, to limit their economic opportunities, and keep them in a subordinate position.
Things like vagrancy laws, where black people could be arrested and forced into labor if they didn't have a job.
Right. Or laws that prevented them from owning property or voting.
It was a way to maintain the old power structures, despite the end of slavery.
Exactly. And these black codes were a major impetus for the passage of the 14th Amendment.
Because it became clear that simply ending slavery wasn't enough.
Right. The federal government needed to step in and actively protect the rights of black citizens if true equality was ever going to be achieved.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of violence and legal discrimination. And then right in the middle of it all, you've got President Andrew Johnson.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Lincoln's successor, who, by all accounts, was not exactly a champion of racial equality.
He was very much a man of his time, and his views on race were far from progressive.
He actively resisted efforts to grant black people full citizenship rights.
He vetoed key legislation like the Freedmen's Bureau Bill,
which was meant to provide assistance to formerly enslaved people.
Yeah, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866.
Which would have granted citizenship and basic rights to black people.
Exactly. And these vetoes really set the stage for the political battles that were to come over the 14th Amendment.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing, right? Violence in the South, political infighting in Washington, and a president who's actively trying to undermine the cause of racial equality.
And it's into this incredibly charged atmosphere that the 14th Amendment is born.
A truly revolutionary document for its time.
Absolutely. It was a bold attempt to redefine what it meant to be an American citizen and to create a more just and equitable society.
But as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, the fight to implement and enforce the 14th Amendment was only just beginning.
It was a long and difficult struggle, and it's a struggle that continues in many ways to this day.
Stay with us. It's a shame, isn't it, how such a promising piece of legislation could be met with such resistance.
Yeah, it is. It's a real tragedy, and, it's a story that repeats itself throughout history, these moments of great progress followed by backlash and attempts to roll back those gains.
It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
Right, and unfortunately, in the case of the 14th Amendment, the pendulum swung back pretty hard.
So what happened? I mean, how did the South and its allies manage to undermine the 14th Amendment?
Well, it was a multi-pronged attack. You had violence and intimidation directed at black people and those who supported their rights.
The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups.
Exactly. And then you had political maneuvering. You had southern states passing laws that were designed to circumvent the 14th Amendment, things like poll taxes and literacy tests that were meant to disenfranchise black voters.
And all of this happening under the watchful eye of a federal government that was increasingly reluctant to intervene.
Right after Reconstruction ended, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and that really left black people vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
It's like the promise of protection just evaporated.
It did, to a large extent. And then on top of all of that, you had the Supreme Court.
Yes, the Supreme Court.
Which issued a series of rulings that really gutted the 14th Amendment's power.
Decisions like the Slaughterhouse cases and U.S. v. Cruikshank.
Exactly. These cases essentially said that the 14th Amendment only applied to actions taken by the state government, not by private individuals.
So if a white person attacked a black person or denied them their rights, it wasn't a violation of the 14th Amendment because it wasn't the state doing it.
That's basically what the court said. It was a very narrow interpretation of the amendment, and it left black people with very little legal recourse.
It's hard to believe that the court could twist the 14th Amendment in such a way. I mean, it seems so clear in its intention.
Well, you have to remember that the Supreme Court is a product of its time, and the justices who were on the court during this period were very much influenced by the prevailing racial attitudes of the day.
So they were willing to turn a blind eye to the injustices being perpetrated against black people.
In many cases, yes, and that's how you end up with decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson.
The infamous separate but equal case.
Right. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities for black and white people were equal.
Which, of course, they rarely were.
Oh, absolutely. Separate was almost always unequal. But the Plessy decision gave legal sanction to Jim Crow and paved the way for decades of legalized segregation.
It's amazing to think that this decision stood for almost 60 years.
It is, and it really shows how powerful the Supreme Court can be in shaping social and political reality.
So the 14th Amendment, which was meant to be this beacon of equality, ended up being used to justify a system of racial oppression.
Yeah, it's a tragic irony, and it's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned laws can be twisted and manipulated to serve unjust ends.
But as we know, the story of the 14th Amendment doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. Despite all the setbacks and challenges, the fight for equality continued.
And eventually the 14th Amendment would be resurrected as a powerful weapon in that fight.
That's right. It would take decades of struggle and sacrifice, but eventually the promise of the 14th Amendment would begin to be realized.
And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive, the resurgence of the 14th Amendment and its role in the civil rights movement. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? How this one amendment has had such a lasting impact on American society.
It really is. It's been over 150 years since the 14th Amendment was ratified, and it's still one of the most debated and litigated parts of the Constitution.
Yeah, and as we've seen in the previous parts of this deep dive, It hasn't always been an easy journey.
Not at all. It's been a constant struggle to ensure that the 14th Amendment's promise of equality is actually upheld in practice.
And that struggle continues to this day.
It does. I mean, think about some of the most pressing issues we're facing right now. Things like voting rights, affirmative action, LGBTQ rights.
Immigration, even?
Exactly. All of these issues are in some way connected to the 14th Amendment and its interpretation.
It's like this amendment from the 1860s is still shaping how we think about rights and equality in the 21st century.
It is, and that's what makes it so fascinating and so relevant. The 14th Amendment is not just a historical artifact. It's a living document that's still being debated and reinterpreted today.
So let's talk about some of those contemporary debates. I mean, one of the big ones right now is voting rights.
Right. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was used to guarantee the right to vote for Black men. But of course, we know that there were all sorts of ways that right was suppressed for decades.
Things like poll taxes and literacy tests.
Exactly. And even today, we're seeing new efforts to restrict voting rights, particularly targeting minority communities.
And these efforts are often challenged on the grounds that they violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
Right. The argument is that these restrictions disproportionately impact certain groups of voters, and therefore they're unconstitutional.
And it's not just voting rights. I mean, the 14th Amendment is also being invoked in debates about affirmative action.
Yeah. Affirmative action policies are designed to address historical discrimination by giving certain groups preferential treatment in areas like education and employment.
And there's a lot of debate about whether or not those policies are still necessary and whether or not they violate the 14th Amendment.
Right. Some people argue that affirmative action is reverse discrimination, that it's actually giving an unfair advantage to certain groups at the expense of others.
And others argue that it's essential to level the playing field and to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity.
Exactly. And the courts are constantly grappling with these questions, trying to balance the need for equality with the principle of non-discrimination.
And then, of course, there's the whole debate about LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, in recent years, we've seen some major victories for the LGBTQ community in the courts, and a lot of those victories have been based on the 14th Amendment.
Cases like Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage nationwide.
Right, that case was based on the idea that the 14th Amendment guarantees the right to marry to everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation.
And we're also seeing the 14th Amendment being used to challenge discrimination against transgender people.
Absolutely. There's a growing recognition that discrimination based on gender identity is a form of sex discrimination and therefore violates the 14th Amendment.
It's amazing to think that this amendment, written over 150 years ago, could be used to address issues that the framers could never have imagined.
It is. It speaks to the power and the flexibility of the Constitution. It's a document that can adapt to changing social norms and values.
But that adaptability also makes it a source of constant debate.
Right, because the 14th Amendment doesn't provide all the answers. It lays out some broad principles like equal protection and due process, but it's up to the courts to interpret those principles and apply them to specific cases.
And those interpretations can change over time depending on the makeup of the court and the prevailing political climate.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to understand the history of the 14th Amendment and the different ways it's been interpreted over the years.
Because that history can help us understand the debates that are happening today.
It can, and it can also help us think critically about how we want to apply the 14th Amendment in the future. What kind of society do we want to create? What does true equality mean? These are questions that we all need to be asking ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the 14th Amendment.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this exploration of one of the most important and complex amendments to the Constitution.
We hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue to engage with these important issues.
Until next time, this is the Deep Dive signing off.